Welcome to the show. This is the Magician and the Fool podcast, episode number 60. My name is Dominic. I am one of the co-hosts of the show. The other co-host is Janus, and he will be here shortly. Today we had the pleasure of speaking with Mr. Jon Graham. Jon is the acquisitions editor for Inner Traditions, and he's been doing that for quite a few decades, I believe. He is also a translator, I would also say an artist, and probably an esotericist, mystic. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that's the impression I get. Definitely an interesting character with a very colorful past and a lot of wisdom and perspective. Before we jump into the episode, we just want to say thank you to our Patreon supporters. I say it every time, but it's true. Without the support of our Patreon members, it would be very difficult to keep the show running, as there are some underlying costs to doing this sort of thing. If you would like to partner with us and ensure that this experiment continues, please feel free to go over to Patreon and do what you can. We dedicate this to Hermes and Asclepius. May any merits that we accumulate doing this work be distributed to all sentient beings so that they, together with us, may equally realize awakening. Okay, we are super excited to have Mr. Jon Graham here on the show. Jon is the acquisitions editor for Inner Traditions. He's a translator, and he's got a lot of fascinating interests. We're going to cover those, particularly Surrealism, the artists of that genre, as well as mysticism, magic, and whatever else comes up. Welcome to the show, Jon.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, glad to have you here.
Absolutely. So, as we always do, maybe let's start off, if you don't mind, with a little bit about yourself, your background, and then maybe let's veer into more specific focus of how you got interested in Surrealism, and we'll go from there.
Well, I've had fairly wide variety of trades in my life before I became, involved with the publishing industry. I was a bookseller before this, but I've also worked for a circus, worked as a bike messenger in New York and San Francisco. Still have back pains from my attempts to ride up Bush Street on a bike in San Francisco. But, about 20 some odd years ago, I'd done a translation for Inner Traditions, and then I was doing readers' reports because they were getting a lot of books from French publishers, and they had no one here that could read them. So I would read them and tell them what I thought. And a position for an editor came up, and I was invited to apply, and it turned out that I was able to function much more beneficially as acquiring books, as I hadn't really been a defined position until I got here. So, but my own interests paralleled that in book selling and in working in the publishing industry. I became interested in Surrealism years ago as a rebellious youth, and I discovered, I think it was Nadeau's History of Surrealism, and poetry is a debacle of the intellect. It can be nothing but. And I'm like, this is the stuff. And I discovered Rimbaud and Lautréamont, people like that. And that was my major influence as a teenager. And as I got more and more familiar with what Surrealism was doing, it opened up the esoteric world to me, that I saw more and more confluences, not just, analogy, mystical analogy, poetic analogy in the surrealist sense are, identical. I mean, the surrealists abandoned the metaphysical aspect, the idea of another world that is key to the idea of mystical correspondences. But in essence, if you read Breton's essay "Rising Sign," it's not that big a deal. I mean, the people that are more inspired by the political positions of surrealism would vociferously disagree with me, but that part of surrealism isn't one of my main focuses. And I often find that as a surrealist poet who I've been friends with for a long time, Annie Lebrun, said she used to call them Boy Scout surrealists. They're the ones that were addicted to heady sensations and the idea of postponing all their disappointments were always going to be resolved tomorrow. And she and her husband Radovan Isvitz in the 70s, after the dissolution of the French surrealist group, started their own edition called Edition Maintenant, which means now. And it was taken from Arthur Crevin, who was one of those eccentric figures at the turn of the century in France who came over, and I'm Oscar Wilde's nephew. I'm a boxer. He was had a relationship with the poet Mina Loy, and then he disappeared. So somehow sailing from Veracruz, he was supposed to go somewhere in South America. And no, he's never heard from again. But he was a larger-than-life figure, kind of like Alfred Jarry. And they took that now as, to say, we need to focus on imminence, not always be postponing things until those days of singing tomorrows arrive, which is what the left was always telling their followers, just hold forth because dialectical materialism is guaranteed to function. And it was my dealings with the surrealists when I lived in Paris were mainly with the ones that were interested in the more occult aspects, esoteric aspects. I mean, it was an interesting time. The group had broken up in '69, so it was like all these different factions.
And when were you there?
I've been in France several times. When I lived there in the '80s, my wife was a student at the Chambre Syndicale de Haute Couture. So I was working as a messenger in New York. I'd make a lot of money because I could just sock away a lot of money. Then I'd just go to France and just stay there and do nothing but artwork and write and meet with surrealists. It was like idyllic.
Yeah, sounds like it.
A major time of a lot of things crystallized that.
What a life, man! I'm envious. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was also. I mean, there was a lot of. A lot of the members of the group didn't get along with each other at all. And guys always told, "Hey, if you go see so and so, don't mention me because he'll freak out." And little did I know when I first went there. This friend of mine, Davey Williams, who was part of the surrealist group in Birmingham, Alabama. They had a journal called Glass Veil. He said, "Oh, you need to go to Jose Pierre. He was an art historian who was a member of the surrealist group, and he's really funny. He's great." So I, gave him a call when I got to Paris. He said, "Come on over," and we were getting along famously. And I just said, "So whatever happened to so and so and so and so?" And I mentioned Annie Lebrun, and all of a sudden, this noticeable chill came in, and Annie and Radovan, who I was actually the closest with, who I became closest with, were so intransigent about things that a lot of the ex-surrealists who they described as running around the ministries trying to pick up crumbs, to finance, to get a grant or subsidize some sort of surrealist work, which was totally not in the spirit of surrealism. So they were looked at rather dismally by the people that were trying to turn their experience of surrealism into a platform for being experts. And
Interesting. So let's maybe would you mind explaining from your point of view what is surrealism? Because it sounds like it's obviously a genre of art, but it also seems to branch into philosophy and politics. So what's the glue that is kind of the denominator that gets them all together?
It's funny about surrealism because the descriptions you read of it in the art books or other books are so at odds with each other, but also with what the surrealists themselves said. And the interesting thing is that the surrealists were quite articulate about their aims. I mean, it's ironic in a way. You have these people that are looking to connect with the deep self, free of all the social inhibitions that direct how you present yourself to the world, trying to reach the deeper reaches of the unconscious, which is the same as symbolists or romantics. There is this, removing the social playing field that dictates what you should do, that regiments what you should do. And their view was, what's what Andre Breton in the first Surrealist Manifesto called psychic automatism. And it's just the free functioning of thought will enable you to make connection with that deeper self. And as someone who's done that, you see that when you first start doing it, there's a lot of dross that comes out because we're like fish in a sea of information, and we're just like filled with this crap. And especially now with social media, if you're not vigilant, you're just going to be. I mean, I think the QAnon people like that, don't even realize they're not thinking their own thoughts. They're just parroting propaganda that they've absorbed in such indigestible amounts that it just comes right back out.
Oh, you said it so well there. It's something I think about a lot, the fact that people's minds are colonized by thoughts, by ideological constructs, mind parasites, whatever you want to call it. And, and these things have a life of their own. These egregores, I guess, have a life of their own. And it's just like possession by a spirit in a lot of ways.
That's so true.
And you become a pariah when you refuse to participate in being infected by these parasites, because it's always an attempt to force a person into the opposing camp if that person refuses to participate in your school of fish. But if you refuse to participate in any of them, then you're met with this like outraged perplexity and this desire to annihilate.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's interesting about surrealism because its critics, and, they started, the grave diggers, as the surrealists used to call them, were out with their shovels from the very first. And, there's like these caricatures of surrealism that dominate the cultural imagination that really obscure what it is. And now we've got the unfortunate surrealism is a milk cow on one hand or a punching bag on the others. A lot of radicals view, there's the feminist view of surrealist men as oppressing the women and making them muses. There's the radical left that sees the surrealists as diverting the energy of the working class into profitless activities, and as I guess it was one of the Stalinists said about surrealism is that they pervert what should be just the clear, clean relationships between men and women with all their perversities. Then if you read in the New York Times, Breton is always called a pope. I mean, I get stuff on surrealism. I always do a word search, and if they use pope in there, I want to find out, because that automatically, as Octavio Paz, the Mexican poet, said, anybody who calls Breton a pope is basically saying, I'm a swine. And, the proof is in the pudding. if he was a pope, you'd have a rigorous school, a regiment of regimented images. And the thing you find from all these artists, and the pictorial part of surrealism is really just one factor. There were ethnographers, there were scientists. Michel Leray was a surrealist, went to one of the major African anthropological expeditions in Dakar to Ethiopia with Marcel Grial, who was the French anthropologist who discovered the Dogon's understanding of Sirius before, it was possible for any technology to see it. There's a lot of, surrealism is just a vast subject, but the way, surrealism in popular culture has come to mean something that is just so ludicrous and crazy that it just completely boggles the mind. But
one thing, I don't want to interrupt your thought.
Yeah, that's right. It's actually, if you look at it as surrealism, as super realism, it's like Surrealism, the Superman, as Nietzsche's Superman was also, you could call it the Surrealism. It's a superior form of reason. It wasn't advocating for dream instead of reason. It was like it depreciated reason because reason had too strong a grip and was inhibiting people's ability to develop poetically, to develop their poetic selves. But it was, the trying to establish a non-dual understanding of dream and reality.
It really recalls the idea of the Aboriginal dream time being this, the state of primordial creativity and constant genesis, or like the Egyptian Zep Tepi. It's the same thing, really. You anticipated what I was going to mention, is that I'm intrigued by the state of the primacy of dream and surrealism, and the way that returning to that state of, you could say, like pre-rational or non-rational consciousness as a valid state of awareness that is implicitly creative and powerful.
No, that's totally true. I totally support that. And there's this, I guess the easiest way to think about it is that there's an exoteric surrealism, which is what most people think of it as, and then there's the esoteric surrealism, which is what the insider's view. The esoteric has always been what you learn from the inside. You get that if you're working on any magical path. All of a sudden you reach this point once you've been initiated, so to speak, and surrealism depends a lot on self-initiation. There isn't a lot out there, but there was a group that kept your feet to the fire, as it were, and would also, dump people that were not helpful, like Salvador Dali, when he was trolling people by, talking about, how he wanted to have sex with Hitler, and, Hitler was like, the most surreal being alive. And they're like, we don't need you anymore.
Well, Dali also had that idea of erratocomatose lucidity.
Yeah.
He was literally doing magic. He was a lot of his art was an act of intentionality. Even if he wasn't necessarily doing magic to produce concrete effects in the outside world, it seems like his whole intention was magical.
Yeah, and I think you find that with a number of other surrealist artists, Victor Bronner, Leonora Carrington. Victor Bronner is especially interesting because his father was a medium, and he, in reaction to his father's life, he was rather a doctrinal Marxist, became a surrealist painter. And I think sometime in the late 30s, he lost an eye due to an accident. But what was really shocking about this is that he had foretold the loss of an eye. He had been doing paintings, including a self-portrait of him several years before, without an eye. And he did a very weird mystical look. It's like a very magical painting where this figure has a sword plunged through its eye, and there's the D at the end. And the person who threw the bottle that broke, and a piece of glass took his eye out, and he was trying to break up a fight between that the bottle thrower and another surrealist, was Oscar Dominguez. So there's the D. And Pierre Mabie, who was, we've translated one of his books that I pushed to do it. I was really hopeful that it would attract more attention because he's written a number of great books, including a book on egregores from pre-World War II that's quite interesting. And he was a student of Pierre Piolle, who was a major French occult thinker, who was the first to translate Flood into French out of Latin. And he was an MD plus an astrologer back when astrology was not something you could read in newspaper columns. In fact, he delivered Andre Breton's daughter, and the next day came and drew up her chart. So, it was very fascinating.
That's so cool.
Individual. And he wrote this text about, the painter in the eye that documented this whole thing. But after Victor Bronner lost his eye, his painting changed completely. And he looked at it as a kind of shamanic transformation. And his work got incredibly magical. And you see when he was hiding in France, because he was Jewish, the American authorities wouldn't give him a visa to escape France. So he moved into the hills. And because he was one-eyed, the locals knew he was a magician and steered clear of him, that he would, hex them if they messed with him. And, he said, even though Hitler made it against the law for me to breathe, somehow I survived. And he was...
this is so interesting to me, too, because you're talking about this man who documented this act of essential artistic precognition. And then, what you would have no way of knowing is last night, I had a meeting I have a diviners circle that meets here. We discussed divination, and I had a specific conversation with several people about how losing an eye gives you insight into the inner world, because one of the people there, her left eye doesn't work. And then here you are in this interview discussing the loss of an eye as a magical gift, and the fact of the precognition of a story of losing an eye the day after I'm having a conversation about the exact same topic.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah, well, that's what the Surrealists would call objective chance, which is one of the most prominent forms of where magic and surrealist activity dovetail.
Can you elaborate on that? That was actually my next question. Funny enough, just the idea of objective chance, is it the same as synchronicity?
Yeah, it's basically it's like synchronicity, but the surrealists used to record this happening. In Breton's book Mad Love, he writes about going to the Paris flea market with Giacometti, and they both found things there that resolved long-standing intellectual problems they'd been having. Giacometti had been trying to figure out how to finish this work, and it was driving him nuts. And he found this old gas mask or something that is now a stylized version of that. It was part of one of his most famous sculptures. And Breton found this wooden shoe with a Cinderella slipper a wooden spoon with a Cinderella slipper at one end. It was like this thing that just sort of resolved this kind of emotional thing. And also the book itself, he talks about one of his poems that he least liked, foretold in explicit detail the night that he first met his second wife. And all of a sudden he realized that, he had, when he was going through that night with her, his poem started flashing back to him. But
interesting.
Yeah, I've had things with objective chance. When I was a messenger, I was like, and I view Facebook that way too. I call it the one-armed bandit of objective chance. You just have to see what comes up. If you're go in there and just say, what's going to pop up in response to something you're thinking about. It's sort of like bibliomancy. You open the page of a book, and whatever you fall upon has the key to what you're trying to solve.
It's really intriguing. I have my child is one of my children, especially. I have two. My child is very unconsciously psychic. So, it's caused me, witnessing this on myriad occasions, it's caused me, and I've experienced this, and I've seen it in others that I've been close to, and it's caused me to sort of reevaluate. I love the term of objective chance because it's caused me to reevaluate these experiences, which, are probably constantly happening. It's really the simultaneity of reality. I think maybe Buddhism anticipates it a little bit in Dzogchen and in the idea of dependent origination, but it's just such an interesting idea, this idea that it's not a volitional psychism. It's an unconscious psychism that's pre-existent.
Yeah, I've had incidences where that happened. Yeah, at a point when I was a bike messenger and I was, trying to, making a decision whether to continue the path I was on or just braking and doing something totally new. I get to a stoplight and there were too many pedestrians, so I couldn't run it. And the car that was right next to me had a vanity plate that said "follow." But and Hegel talks about objective chance. It's where internal reality external reality mirrors internal necessity.
It's fascinating. And so, from the surrealist paradigm, how would one tap into that in a practical sense, or through some sort of practice, just through making art?
The basic practice would be, just automatic writing, just writing that out until you reach that point where the lead that's coming out of your head gives way to gold. And, it's interesting because the surrealists, a lot of the first generation, the heroic generation, became famous artists, Magritte, Ernst, all of those people. But they all started with the idea of just being modest recorders of what their unconscious gave them. And that was what Breton was always pushing for. And when he wrote he wrote about automatic writing, the history of automatism as being one of unrelieved failure. Is one of the reasons is that too many people were trying to turn it into aesthetic objects, and we're missing the dynamic and they were excluding thereby the dynamic that brought it into being. And the dynamic is what he was always about. And you see the evolution of Breton's thought. Where he was in the 1920s in the first Surrealist Manifesto is not where he is in the third manifesto, the Prolegomena, which all talks about the great invisibles. And you also with Surrealism, there are many different groups. The Belgian group was very Marxist. They were very hostile to Breton's overt use of the occult and mystical things in like the 1947 exhibition, which Bronner and all these artists made altars and they had all these alchemical illusions. It was never absent from surrealism. In the second manifesto, he said, he was looking for alchemy. Like in alchemy, the imagination was going to take a stunning revenge on all things. And in the first manifesto, he's talking about mediums and using that's, so psychic automatism, it's like making the connection to the deep self. And once you've made it, you realize it's there. And, it's ironic, that these modest recorders all became, world famous artists. Mm-hmm. But again, they also belie the impression of surrealism as some sort of regimented art activity, because you can never mistake a Bronner painting for a Dali painting, for a Magritte painting, for an Ernst painting, for a Tanguy painting. Everybody's paintings are so unique. It's not a school. It's not like mannerism.
Yeah. But visually there is a connection. So how would you describe the visual aspect of surrealism and what connects the different aspects if they are so different from artist to artist?
Well, it's the spirit that generated them. It's the unconscious that they're pulling them out from, and so they're idiosyncratic. There's a lot of paradox in surrealism. The scholarly view try to tether us to their pictorial understanding of it, because they're not really comfortable with the ideas underneath it. So, as a way to just say it was an art movement, dismisses the intellectual ferment. And, there are many of the writers that were also artists. Breton made really interesting art objects. Belmer, whose art is, incredibly profound and mind-stopping, wrote a book. His book isn't like a theoretical explanation of his work. It's more a poetic counterpart. And it's like poetry is like the key, but it's poetry understood in, Breton, Baudelaire's sense of correspondence as an analogy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and then when you get into Baudelaire, you're looking at that overlap between the symbolist and the surrealist schools, and he was the enfant terrible of that idea, because it's like heresy among the symbolists almost to be doing that, but really there's more overlap than they're willing to admit. I think Apollinaire is another good example of that, or even Mallarmé. I mean, what's a chance records a roll of the dice or whatever. I mean, a lot of the symbolists were playing with very surrealists.
Oh yeah, no, I mean when you read the stuff that hasn't been translated, and I've read tons of things. I mean, Breton and Aragon, the leading thinkers of surrealism, especially during the period when it transitioned from Dada to the surrealist movement, they were talking about Kant's categorical imperative and Hegel and Fichte and all of these important philosophers. But that's something that you rarely see in the scholarly overviews of surrealism. And as I said, surrealism is more than meets the eye. It's paradoxical. A lot of the surrealist writing is reversals in the form of when Isidore Ducasse wrote poesies, he was taking moralistic writers like Pascal, Vauvenargues, and reversing what they said for his own particular ends. And Breton did that, and it went unrecognized by so many people. They don't realize that. Even the first line in English, it's such as the belief in life and the most precarious aspects of life, by which is meant real life, that in the end, belief is lost. And that's based on a French proverb about you take the bucket to the well so much and fill it with water that in the end you can't carry water with it because it's so he's got the rhythm of it, but people will recognize that. People would automatically, French readers would automatically feel that idea was familiar, even though it's transporting utterly unacceptable ideas to the majority of people. And you've got his book titles, Les Pas Perdus, which means the lost steps. To us, that's just a poetic title. But in the French, at the Salle des Pas Perdus, the Hall of Lost Steps is the traditional name for a waiting room at a train station. And he would take these cliches, these commonplaces, and renew them, put them in a new context, so that all of a sudden it would sort of like a trapdoor out of everyday life into a deeper perspective.
A subversion of the mundane by a transposition of the supermundane.
Exactly. Yeah. Good way to put it.
And would you say the catalyst for all of this, I mean, you mentioned Dadaism a second ago, was essentially the horrors of World War I that kind of set this movement off to a degree?
That was good. That's a good part. I mean, I don't agree that was the sole thing, that they would have been just, happy to become respectable poets and painters if World War I hadn't come along.
Yeah. Because
they were, it's what Radovan Ivdic is a surrealist, a Franco-Croatian playwright. He used to talk about the amorous heresy that could be traced all the way back to Hermes, and the surrealism was the latest example of that. That these are ideas that are always on the fringes, always on the margins, and often violently suppressed by the Inquisitions and whatnot. And, so I tend to feel that the war was a great Athenor, a crucible for that. And they were all part of it. I mean, Paul Eluard and Max Ernst realized that they had probably been shooting at each other at one of the battles that was fought during World War I. And as a complete exposure of hollowness of all the stated values of Western culture at that time, World War One. It can't be surpassed. I mean, it's still horrific today.
Right.
A movie that just won all the Academy Awards, Quiet on the Western Front. That's just relentless brutality. It's like,
it's hard for us to imagine the mental damage that would cause. Large picture on society, as well as all the individuals involved.
But one of the saving graces, as it were, in World War I, Breton met Jacques Vacher, who was one of I'd say his dominant influence, who wasn't really a poet. He actually scorned poets, as he called them. And he was a champion of humor without the H. And he wrote like 7 or 8 letters to Breton that Breton later published. And he was like, he stole an English officer's uniform that he used to go to wear to do things. And, he died of a drug overdose in Nantes in 1919. And it's still not known whether he did it on purpose or it was an accident and somebody died with him. And that was all part of the mystique that, he was just so, he was so not enthralled to bourgeois expectations of life. He was so completely free. It was like Lacenaire, the great criminal of 19th century Paris. That's in the. Have you ever seen that movie, The Children of Paradise?
No.
Yeah, it's a good movie.
This also makes me think a lot about the magician as traditional role as archetype, because one of the reasons that it could be argued that the magician is often outlawed in culture is because the magician exists at the boundaries of reality and threatens the sort of collective paradigm with the incursion of alien forces and the weakening of the dominant paradigm. And we see this in this kind of art as well.
Well, yeah, and you see that in societies I'd say might be more functional, healthier societies, such as Native American or like the indigenous societies. There was room for that. The shaman, like the Sioux, had the Rotten Belly Society that was, the opposite of all the noble warrior values for all the people that didn't fit into that, because their contributions to the people would be different. But they weren't shunned. There were no jails. I mean, there weren't no asylums.
It's like the Eastern, it's like in Tantra, where the things that are abhorred in the Shakta cult are the sacraments.
Yep.
So there's that inversion, there's that value inversion that's necessary to become free, and it's also just necessary for some who are naturally outsiders. It really results in a sacrality of those who are different, of the outsiders, rather than making pariahs of them. And I see a third thing happening in our culture now, where the idea of the outsider is fetishized into a parody of the reality of it. And then that in turn is objectified and commodified and sold back to the public as a simulacrum.
That's what I wrote a preface to the translation of Belmer, and I talked about the switchbacks of modern discourse, the opaque, that just kept adding more levels of opacity at every turn, so that all that was left was the agenda. And I still believe that. I think that many people are incapable of really seeing writing or speaking as anything that can be free of an agenda, that you're just allowing the spirit within to speak, to express itself. Most people are always looking that there's something you're selling, there's something, but that's inherent in the world we live in, where everything is a commodity, everything is the modern right wing is all about weaponization now, but weaponization of culture has been going on for a very long time. And now that it's coming back to haunt them, they don't like it, but it's inevitable.
Right. So let's talk about someone I don't think we have touched on yet. Kurt Seligman.
Kurt. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you did a translation of his work, and it was published through, is that right? Through Inner
Well,
Traditions?
his book was originally published, I think, by Random House in New York, and with the Seligman Foundation, we got the rights to rescan the. I found a really good copy of the first edition, and we scanned it and just recreated it because a lot of inferior versions of it had been released in the intervening years, where the art was poorly reproduced, things were just chopped out, and so we put it together in a nice package.
It's beautiful, and this book rocked my world when I was maybe 19 or 20. I was fortunate enough to have access to a first edition of it because I worked in an occult bookstore, and it was I just loved. I mean, it's such an amazing, excellent book. I mean, it's a feast for the eyes. The writing is profound and insightful, and I feel like a pretty balanced examination as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's one of the key books. I mean, and especially at the time it was written. You think, we live in a time where, there's a wealth of books on magic. I mean, and there's a lot of dross in there, but because I'm doing a lot of study of runes and Norse cosmology, and there's some good stuff and there's a lot of bad stuff. But Kurt Seligman just had a very, it's a good foundation, good foundational work on which to undertake your journey to any of the different schools of magic he discusses or traditions.
And the book we're talking about is The Mirror of Magic. Do you feel, and it sounds like you probably do, you feel like it stands the test of time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it does. I mean, my job, I get to see a lot of stuff that nobody ever sees because it doesn't go past me.
Yeah.
And so I have a sense of, the dangers of the squirrel mind, where people, as soon as they reach an impediment and their chosen path of initiation, then hop to another branch and do something else, or take a year off to do Reiki or something. And then, but they never get to that point where, for me, magic is all about transformation. If you can't transform yourself, you can't change other things. But it's also, it's like the German romantics understood, it's inside that you see the outside. Mm-hmm. That was Novalis. Goethe even said it. It's like, you go within to really see what's out.
And I've seen kind of people that are, I don't know if it's a fear of that alchemical process, but there seems to be a trend where that the inner vision is kind of secondary. What people really think is the good stuff is making something happen outside of themselves first and foremost. But I think you're right that alchemical change should probably come first, and is probably more important.
That was the purpose of the great work.
Yeah,
I read something that was trying to debunk Nicholas Flamel as being an alchemist because, well, if he was so good, why didn't he have a lot of gold? That's the proof, is that he didn't need gold by the time he finished the great work, because that's once you realize it, why you want what you want.
Yeah.
You're no longer a slave to your appetites. You're no longer a slave to whatever transitory desires are flitting through, and you've reached a deeper level of self, so that the things that might have drawn you into alchemy are no longer important when you reach the exit.
Nicely said. Very nicely said.
It's also that state of ecstasy, whether we're talking about the Dionysian ecstasis, which takes you out of the self, or the Odinic ecstasis, which really is a sort of a entering into the depths of the self. But there's this upwelling of transrational power, and vision is such a huge part of that too. The idea of vision, and what is an artist without vision? What is a magician without vision? It almost seems, vision is sacred in traditional culture. You were talking about the Lakota before, and I mean, vision is primary to the mysteries in their culture, from what I understand.
No, I mean, you couldn't be a functioning human being within that social context if you hadn't gone on a vision quest. That's how you became who you were. That's how you grew into the person that would be, a full member of the people. And it's funny you say that about trance, because before the Surrealist Manifesto, in between Dada, which was sheer provocation, scandal for the sake of scandal, and just, unbridled trolling of conventional wisdom and those who represented it. And the first Surrealist Manifesto, where psychoautomatism was defined, there was a period called they call it the period of sleeping fits. It was actually trance states where a number of surrealists were experimenting with going into trance states. And the poet Robert Durneau was writing these aphorisms and puns that were like really close to those of Marcel Duchamp. But he said he and Marcel had established this link in their brains when he was in trance, so that he could just, the same kind of thought would come out. And he was apparently the best of going into trance states. Rene Crevel, another one, was also good at it. But it's interesting that the trance state is key, because when Odin is on Yggdrasil for 9 days, that's a trance state. He's going into a trance state, and I see a lot of connections. I mean, that's something I'm still working on it, but it's this idea that si alpha me, myself to myself. When Odin is on the tree, he says, I sacrifice myself to Odin, myself to myself. That to me is psychic automatism, is that you're sacrificing the social construct that you have as an ego, as an identity, to a deeper self within that has access to deeper insights, greater understanding, and is actually, the magician archetype is within. But you can only reach that by being the fool. And that's what the trance state is about. You're letting go. You're letting go of control. And that's, that is the social identification of a fool, is that they have no boundaries. They have no sense of decorum.
That's so true. And it goes into so many levels. I mean, of course, in some schools of Buddhism, the anatta really means that that the self is simply a construct. But in others, it's really speaking about what you were talking about, the constructed personality, and even how that's a product of prior karmas. But there is there's an indestructible Buddha mind. So whether it's present, that self is present, and it's an incredible to go, to make that transition. But that transition has a sacrificial aspect, just like what you said about Odin, because you have to be willing to experience the death of the construct that most people, that's the only self they know.
That's true. I mean, I wrote a piece for it was the Folger magazine. Can't remember the name right off the bat. Victor Bronner, which was all about the conflict between objective chance and the will that the magician draws upon to work as well. That there's obviously, if you're just going to be available, disponible, as the French say, you're not working your will. So there's like a tension there that I think Bronner was able to find that sweet spot, which, in surrealist terms, I call it the unsilvered mirror, which is like glass, mirror at the same time. And that his work draws from both, that he was a magician. I mean, he tried to work magic. He has some really interesting anecdotes about his practices, and he realized that he wasn't really good as a magician, that he was causing unintended consequences, that it involved one was he had a crush on Dora Maar, who was Picasso's famous model for the Weeping Woman, but also an incredibly good photographer, surrealist photographer. And he gave her a scarf and also a painting. And in the painting, he like snuck in this little thing where their initials were entwined. And the next time he saw her, she came to return his scarf, which he had lent her, and she had a black eye. And she said, I don't know what it was. I opened the door with my dad. He just punched me in the eye. And then he said, I don't know why I did that. And then Bronner was like, oh, I'm messing with forces I don't really understand yet.
Wow. So, I mean, that's an interesting cautionary tale, because my next question was going to be, practically speaking, how can people, where can people begin on this path? Because it is such a all-encompassing topic. What's a good way for someone to start? I know that you can go the poetry route, you can go the visual art route, you can go the writing route. Where would you suggest someone started if they just want to maybe start to just dig a little deeper into this world?
Well, again, I'd say it's just, to touch base with yourself and to just throw out all aesthetic concerns. Right. I mean, I have reams of automatic writing that I've kept that is just garbage. But, it enables you to just flush out stuff. And eventually you reach that deeper level. And I think it's the same for drawing. I mean, I do things now, and it's like, once you reach that thing where you're not trying to create a specific result.
Yeah.
You're not trying to solicit a reaction, that you're just doing what comes out. You'll find some treasures. And then, Breton, if you see his manuscripts, he rewrote everything. I mean, everything's crowded. It wasn't just pure automatism. But what the point is that he was able to reach these things, these insights, by just letting his hand write without any interference by his mind. And he and Philippe Sepult experimented with speeds. They were looking at, if you write as fast as you can, if you write as slow as you can, look at different ways, and Surrealism was big on games. I mean, half their activity was playing games with each other, like the Exquisite Corpses.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things, they did that over and over. There was the game One and the Other, which was like this riddle game that just seems completely impossible, but they would just guess each other's answers. Like Benjamin Perret goes in and describes some coffee sock, and somebody were like, oh, it's the Amazon River. But they just had tons of game. When Radovan and Annie came to New York at Group Hydra, which was a offshoot of was what the French called the dissident surrealists, because in America we have the Chicago Surrealist Group, which is the orthodox group, and they're the last big surrealist exhibit beyond surrealism. Mm-hmm. That ends in the 80s with Ted Jones and the Chicago Surrealist Group, and I have a rather ambiguous relationship with them. Most of my friends are the people that left them, who describe their animator as a ubu caricature trapped in a hall of mirrors. And so I'm not, and they're very political. That's his whole thing. He's always quoting Lenin and Marx and making that, and that doesn't. I'm not really. That's not my thing.
Yeah.
So,
and you're a book guy.
Yeah.
So what books would you recommend?
Well, if you're really interested in surrealism, I mean, the key books are Surrealist Manifestos, Peasant of Paris, and Treatise on Style by Louis Aragon, Breton's book Nadja, Mad Love. I mean, you basically just everything by Breton. Mm-hmm. And when I was younger, it was the first manifesto, second manifesto. Second manifesto is still amazing. It's got so many alchemical prescriptions in it. And, that's where he called for the veritable occultation of surrealism, because the public understanding of it was threatening to capsize its principles. But the one that really interests me is his last one, which is in a much different place, which was the Prolegomena to a Third Manifesto of Surrealism, or what. And it's just filled with these little, it's very short, but he just throws out these things, about, he was envisioned creating ideas that would spread like fire in the minds of those who read them, but actually, because they just ended up making big clouds of dust out of them. And he said, we realized that, you have to realize as a creator that the caliber of the mind who created something is not going to be the same. You're not going to find the same caliber of minds everywhere. So you're going to have to expect that reduction of your thought.
Well, I also wanted to mention another thing that's great about this movement is the fact that it continues to the present day, and it's had so many interesting iterations. I mean, you mentioned Leonora Carrington, her and Jodorowsky, the Mexican surrealists. They were so focused on magic. They had such a magical emphasis. I mean, it seems like Leonora Carrington spent half her time on the astral plane if you look at her art.
And her friend Remedios Varo was the same.
Oh, Varo's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's still plenty of surrealists today. There's some amazing work being done. Joris Carl-Burkhardt, ex-Chicago group member Tom Burns is an amazing painter. There's Jack Dobbin, who lives in Arizona, who is the only non-Native American artist to ever be featured in American Indian magazine.
Wow.
Because he was doing works with Michael Caboti, I think his name was, of Artist Hopi, where they were doing these murals that combined Celtic and Hopi motifs.
Wow.
And he and his wife, Terry, who's also an amazing artist, live south of Tucson somewhere, not too far from the Mexican border. I mean, there's a lot of surrealist activity. When Jan Svankmajer is still active.
I was going to mention him. Yeah.
Right. And, he makes no bones about he's a surrealist.
If anybody listening to this has not seen the films of Jan Svankmajer, they need to immediately go. I'm showing my age. I think I almost said go to the video store. But
yeah,
I don't know which one's my favorite. Maybe Faust.
Faust is great. Conspiracy of Pleasure. That just I've seen that several times. The chicken.
So good. Alice. I mean, yeah, and I mean, there's we didn't even touch on surrealist cinema really. We could have talked about Buñuel. We could have talked about Jodorowsky. We could have talked about
that's the thing, is that surrealism is not just painting or writing. It's like everything. There's like so many different things. When I first went, the first time I visited Prague, I stayed at the Svankmajer's, and we went to see his films at one of his friends' house who worked for Czech TV because, it was still the communist era. So I had to go register with the secret police because I was staying at a private citizen's house.
Wow.
And the first day I was out there, the neighbor came out to ask me what I was doing. And Jan's wife, Ava, came out and started screaming at her. She said, "Don't talk to her. She's a spy. She works for the state police. Don't, just kick her. Don't talk to her." And he had a friend who worked for Czech TV, and he stole all the clippings from the editing room, all the bloopers, and they made Samizdat films out of them. And I saw all these great Svankmajer films, and then my Czech was not up to catching it. So Ludwig Svab, who was alive then, was the member of the Czech Surrealist group, was translating for me and explaining the context. And you have these people that were like the Lester Holt of Czech TV, blowing their lines and then saying, "Well, it doesn't matter anyway. It's all lies." And there was like this guy from the secret police who was in charge of morality for the youth. So he did this whole thing for him that apparently was quite popular, spread in secret throughout Prague, where it looked like he was masturbating furiously under the table while he was, delivering moral prescriptions.
Oh my God.
But he had film cans filled with this stuff. He says it's inexhaustible. Every day they do something wrong, and I just bring it home. And
That's awesome.
How cool it was. Oh, man, that must have been so amazing to watch that. It's like that too. It's almost a necessity against, in the war against the mundane, and the war against the forces of deadening grayness that seek to eclipse the brilliance of the human spirit. It's necessary to engage in acts of, quote unquote, poetic terrorism, even we could even we could even talk about Brian Geeson, in his cut-ups and the Dream Machine, and all of that. Dom and I remember we were just in our late teens, and we were experimenting with it. We built the Dream Machine, and we experimented it. We were constantly trying to go into different states of trance, and just throw ourselves into this place where there was no rules, into pure formless consciousness.
Well, if I had to define surrealism in one line, it would be like it champions exaltation over depreciation. There's in his Breton's little essay called Rising Sign, or Signe Ascendant. He's talking about the importance of analogy and what the principles of surrealist creative expression is, mainly poetry. But he quotes this incident from Zen, where one of Basho's students said, take a red dragon hide. It's a haiku. Red dragon hide, pull off its wings, pimento. And Basho said, no, you've got it wrong. Pimento, give it wings, red dragonfly. And that, that's Breton's, analogy for what the surrealists are all about. I think that's true. I mean, Annie Lebrun's work, Rada von Ivsitz's work, Leonora Carrington. That's,
Do you like Bataille?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny about Bataille because when I was living in New York at the same time I was in Paris, it was when Rosalind Krauss in October, and she did the L'Amour Fou photo exhibition. And she was like, Bataille's the real surrealist. Breton is like some bourgeois, cook up, I got into a real argument with one of her acolytes. So I was sort of persona non grata. And then I wrote a pastiche of, Annie Lebrun wrote this great book about Sade. And in the magazine October, this guy named Alan Weiss wrote this critique of it. That Sade was only a machine to generate text. Who is this woman saying there's lyrical elements and this or that means nothing? It's just, he was just generating text. So I wrote this thing, I can't remember the title, but it was like, I called him Alan Whiteswats. And, reverse the machine to generate text, to the machine to strengthen passion and philosophy.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, and there you go. There's again a magical principle, the idea of reversion and reversal and inversion.
Yep.
Whether it's a magical act of transgressiveness by embracing the other, or a meditative act of inverting the consciousness from projection into external form, into introversion into, who is it? Milo Rigaud in Milo Rigaud defined voodoo as introspection into the beyond, and I like that.
That's great. Yeah, I haven't read that book in a long time now.
City Lights.
Yeah. No, that was one of my early finds. I mean, there's so many books I found along the way. It's like the list I have is the desert island list. I'd say, well, I have to build a minor Bibliothèque Nationale, French National Library, because there's too many books that I need. I mean, my house was destroyed in a flood like 11, 12 years ago. And I didn't lose everything. And actually, one of the reasons that I didn't was that we were cut off from the world here. So FEMA and all the authorities couldn't get in. So people were just going in and rescuing all the stuff they could. As soon as the state got in, they sealed off the house because they said it was unsafe for people to go in there. But I lost a lot of my library, unfortunately. I did save a lot, but
I know that pain. I had a house fire, and the books are one of the hardest things to lose.
Yep. Well, but it's funny because I had this weird displaced memory where I'd be looking for a book on the shelf, and well, maybe you're just remembering it from the old house, not the new house.
That's torture.
Think, well, if I'm looking for the book, I better get a new copy because I need it. And I do need books for translation. I do a lot of Claude Lecoultre translations, so I'm always getting translations of obscure medieval romances and things just to,
cool.
To be, there's like La Mer Bête, which means the congealed sea. It's like the ice pack as viewed from medieval perspective. But it's all part of, the Imran of St. Brendan and they're all stuck in this congealed sea. But, when you're reading it in French and then you're like, well, am I sure about this? So I'm always triple checking, cross checking with the available data. I do that with Norse stuff because I bought a lot of, I really should learn Old Norse, but I'm really not that. It's like how and when. But I bought a bunch of books by Régis Boyer translations because the French translations can often pick up on things that the English translators don't.
Oh, interesting.
And I've also been picking up some other things by Norwegian and Swedish people because, the edits are just filled with interesting stuff depending how it's translated. And it's like Gullveig. For years, it's like lust for gold. It's not at all. It means gold power drink, gold quaff, gold mead, whatever. It's like, and it's even
the mead bearer.
Yeah, it's even in the names of the dwarves in the same, and then the Voluspa where they talk about Gullveig. One of the dwarfs, like there's Gandalf is there, but there's also Vig, which when they bother to translate the name, they usually do quaff or, spirits or something. So it really speaks to the whole, I don't know if you ever read the book, The Woman with the Mead Cup.
Oh, that's a very important book to these studies. What's interesting to me, I was just thinking this the other day. What's interesting to me is in the Eddas and the other books, there is a polyvalency to the language, this deep poetic substratum. It's so similar to me to what you see in Sanskrit, for instance. Mm-hmm. It's a very similar way that you can't just assign one meaning. And so like any translation into English, which is really the great grandchild of the very practical, down to earth Roman language of Latin, it just does a disservice to something like Old Norse or Sanskrit or anything like that, where there's this language that has all of these meanings are like emanations from a central idea.
No, that's so true. If I had time, I would love to learn Norse, but just to be able to add my own contribution to my own idiosyncratic interpretations. But I have a number of people that we publish Stephen Flowers, who's got incredible understanding of that, and he does read Old Norse and German.
It's really helpful to be able to do that. And that goes back into the consciousness thing. It's like when you're talking about trying to remember, if this book was on the shelf or not, that happens with me sometimes, even with memories. I'll have a memory and I'll be like, wait a minute, was this a memory of something that happened in waking life? Or is this a memory of something that happened to me in a dream? Or is this the memory of a memory I had in a dream?
Absolutely. No, I've had that too. That the thing with the flood was, pretty powerful, but that was one of the things where I really had a mystical thing, because I was in the house when it collapsed. It wasn't flooded so much as that the ground underneath the house was torn out by the water, so the house fell over.
Wow.
And my daughters were like, the cats are still in the house. So my wife and I went in, and she just left with the second cat, who just popped up out of nowhere. I'd been like, it's one of those what if situations, because like a minute before I was on the third floor looking for the cat. Then I went down. I don't know where he is, and there it was. And she grabbed him, and she's like, "Let's get out of here." And I spotted this bag that I had put all our important papers in, and I went to grab it, and it was like a step away from the front door. And the next thing I knew, I was like, the house fell over. It was like all those beams were breaking like rifle shots. And, when I came to, because it was like this, it overrode my senses. It was such a radical event. Then I, came to, and I was under books and all this stuff. But a bookcase actually saved me because it had fallen in such a way that all the rubble went on either side. And I just basically thought to myself, well, it looks like it's over. This is it. And like the water's coming in, and I'm like, and then I just felt this really profound sense of peace that I've never really felt in any other situation. And then this voice, as clear as day from in, I mean, some people would say, oh, a guardian angel or whatever. This voice that I felt coming from within says, well, that's your decision. You can get out, and here's what you need to do. And in pitch blackness, it told me that, I had to take off my coat to get out of this, and guided me out. Wow. And then, of course, I was back into real life, and, the voice disappeared. But since then, it gives me another understanding to what Odin found and what psychic automatism can find.
That's so intriguing. It's so interesting. It's very Laguz. The whole experience is very much the ruin of Laguz.
Yeah, that's good way to look at it.
I remember having dreams once of just a house covered in water, and then I realized when my house burned down that people don't think about the fact that there's the fire, but then there's also the water, because the pipes break and the house becomes flooded with water, and there's water constantly pouring through the house after the fires hit it. And then, of course, it's hit by firemen with water too. Right. So the destruction is always fire and water. It's like they come together at this nexus point of destruction.
So I wanted to touch on one more question before we wrapped up. Okay. And it might be controversial. It's relevant to our current, era. So we had touched on AI earlier before we started recording. And I was wondering if you think that there's any benefit to AI, at least visual art. And to kind of set that up, I'd like to ask, maybe with surrealism, is it more to the benefit of the artist, the art itself, or is it to the viewer, or is it equally beneficial? And if so, could AI art be beneficial? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. No, it's. There's a lot of. Yeah. I have a lot of conflicting thoughts about it, and I know some surrealist artists that use AI, and they do it well, and they make really amazing images. I myself wouldn't do it because I feel like you'd have that computer interface as an intermediary that would be filtering. It would act as a filter in some way to what I'm really looking for. Mm-hmm. But I've seen images, and I'm inspired by surrealist images, even if they were not made for the viewer, so to speak. And I see that, it's like Breton talked about making objects that had no utilitarian purpose. And he discussed this book that was like this 3D dwarf with fur or something. And, and he just put them places so they'd be eruptions of dream into everyday life. Just to, right. Just to exalt rather than depreciate. And AI is writing. I'm not for it. I get a lot of rehash anyway, so I'm very, I'm not receptive to it. And there's a free app that some college student made that could identify ChatGPT generated text that college professors are, using en masse now. And I'm like, well, I need that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just because I don't want to waste my time with somebody, because it's that probably extends into AI in all forms. Can the self-transformation happen if you're not pulling it out, if you're not working deep in the self? And then, as Annie Lebrun, who's very one of the leitmotifs in her work is, there are no ideas without a body. There are no body without ideas. And we live in a world that's constantly trying to partition them. And all her work, and that's just one of the points he makes about Sod, is that he's not a pornographer. He's a philosopher. He's like Hume. He's like, you can find, and all of these things are illustrations of that. And as a even in the works, like, let's say, the Chateau de Chill, 120 Days of Sodom, the people that are the victims are from the upper crust of society. They're not the poor girls that are being trafficked across the world by Saudi Arabian pimp slavers or whatever. I mean, Sod goes right to the top, and they're all aristocrats. I mean, there's a reason they put him in an insane asylum. That his ideas were just too singular.
Thought crimes.
Yeah, he has this great letter, if I can remember it properly. But basically, he's saying, my thought is what defines me, and I was in response to his wife. If you just not try to force your thinking onto others, he said, my thinking hasn't caused me any problems at all. I'm very happy with what I think. It's what other people think that's responsible for my misfortune.
Well, it's funny about this, and I think that points to a essential thing here, which is the reduction of the tendency towards independent thought. We started the conversation with that too, of the idea of the mind that's colonized by ideologies and perspectives and ideas which are really collectively defined, and I believe determined, as like Genesis Peerage called them, the world preset guardians.
Yeah.
And I see in virtual reality an artificial astral plane, and I see in AI there's artificial art. In things like the ChatGPT, this artificial thought, and it's the illusion, the simulacrum, which is becoming a substitute for genuine experience, and it's taking people further out into the realm of the senses, while at the same time paralyzing their agency.
He sums it up nicely.
Yeah, it almost becomes a sacred injunction to magicians and the yogis and the mystics and the runesters to wage war magically on this false reality that's attempting to be formed by the rulers, and reshape reality and for a better, more re-enchant the world for a more magical future against this intrusive. I mean, because it's really, I've said it before, it's a Philip K. Dick world. We just live in it.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that.
It's getting scary how accurate his predictions are becoming. I mean, I'm a huge fan of his books, and it's like things that weren't true 20 years ago when I was reading his stories are now becoming true.
No, he was definitely prescient. You read so much science fiction. I used to read a lot of it when I was a teenager. That the Jetson vision of the world hasn't happened, and I don't think it will. I don't think the driverless car will never function. I don't think it'll. I mean, there's just too many. I just can't see the software that can take into account all the acts of chance that could happen in between your driveway and the store 2 blocks away.
Yeah, that's a good point. So to conclude, if it were up to you, where would things go artistically in the future and magically? What would you like to see the future become?
Oh, that's a question. Well, I mean, I would like to see the polarization, the false polarization that exists, would be dissolved if people were more in touch with their deeper selves. It's like you're seeing, people build a scarecrow, an ideological scarecrow that they use to represent themselves in real life. And you see these, it's like, what were they called? Rock'em Sock'em robots or something, battle bots. Well, it's like these, this pastiche of ideas that are constantly changing in response to whatever is currently popular, and there's no memory left. I look at it, actually, that's actually where I want to go. It's like we're living in a time of Hunan without Mugen, and it doesn't work. That's what social media is. There's no Mugen. And as Odin said, I worry about my ravens every day. I worry that Hunan won't come back, but I really worry that Mugen won't come back. And I think that's memory gives us context. It gives us a frame of reference that provides a deeper sense of things. And, with the surrealist group, you don't have outside of, there's some groups still left. There's a group in Leeds in the UK that's really interesting. A group in Portugal, the Czech group. But, there aren't groups like the French group. It was like this paradoxical thing where you had a collective organization in which individuals could flourish. At the same time, it made possible this pooling of thought, which created a synthesis that they wouldn't have arrived at otherwise. And I'd like to see that kind of camaraderie again. I'd like to be in a world where people could work together and create together without all the garbage. Without, there's so much stuff that we're drowning in trivia.
Yeah, I dream of the same world. I mean, there's this intentional divisiveness and polarization that's created, and really it comes from just an imprisonment in false concepts of identity. And to what you said about memory, I mean, that's what Plato said, all knowledge is remembering. And so supreme knowledge is knowledge of the self, knowledge of the divine, and knowledge of the universe. And if we follow the injunction of memory, then really it has to do with remembering all of these things. And how can you do that if your mind is caught in a spider's web of identity constructs projected? Mm-hmm. Like I'm concerned, the universe is inherently holographic according to one perspective. And yet there's this scary sort of intersection between virtual reality and the virtual reality and the AI and all of these things, which is producing another kind of holographic universe, which is, it's unusual. And so I think that what you said about memory, if we can also remember our origins, wherever those origins are, if you can excavate and go deep and, be like the dwarves and go deep into the mind of the self and excavate.
Well, there's also with remembering, it's like remember, and that echoes this shamanic thing. When the individual is chosen to be a shaman, especially in the Siberian, Mongolian areas, often they have this experience where their entire body is broken into pieces. And the spirits remember them, put them back together. And that, to me, is like, it gives you a deeper resonance for just how important memory is.
That's an excellent point you made there. And I think that it encourages us to return to the archaic perspective and an archaic world.
Yeah, I'm totally on that. I mean, I've been spending the last several years. Well, I went to Iceland, and all of a sudden I had to explore the ruins, and I've been doing that ever since. So
I just had somebody try and tell me the other day, last night, they were like, oh, I just heard recently that the runes actually weren't used for divination, before the 1800s. And I just was like, where did you hear this? And then I remembered, oh no, this is like there is this theme right now to try and discredit the divinatory nature of the runes. But anybody that, I mean, not that there isn't an argument that draws upon actual forensic evidence that completely disproves this point, but anybody who's worked with the runes knows about their psychic power.
Well, they come from the Norns, so you're dealing with what should become.
Yeah.
There's no way around it. And you've got rune scholars like Barnes and Page who are like totally, and Barnes, I think it says, I don't read the eddas or any of that stuff. I don't want my thinking to be contaminated. So he takes the runes totally out of context, so he can just specialize them as marks on stone. And of course, there's and that whole idea that runa means mystery. Well, that's irrelevant. But it's good to read him and see what these people are thinking. But I vehemently disagree with it.
Yeah. So where can people find your work? Where can people find some of the stuff you've done?
Well, I published I published an article on Victor Bronner and Abraxas. My artwork. Latest thing I did, there's some surrealists in New York that I contributed some artwork to a new magazine called Negredo. I've been doing other people's work for so long. I'm actually working on something now, but it's I have a translation of Belmer that's hard to find now, but Dominion Press published it. And I'm still really fond of the translator's preface I wrote for that, because I came up with all these terms that I really enjoy still using, like the modern critics character assassination by psychobabble, which Belmer is particularly subject to, where all of a sudden these professors channel their inner Freud to, dissect Belmer's work.
Nice. Is there anything else that you'd like to plug?
2 books that we're publishing by Marlena Seven Bremner. The first one just came out, and there's another one.
We love her work. Yeah, we had her on the show for the first one. Yeah.
I just got the advanced copy. It's not due out till July, but we got a copy in, so I snatched it up.
Awesome.
It's great. And she has a chapter on surrealism in it. And she's wonderful. I mean, I'm just like thrilled.
Yeah, we love her.
Yeah. And she's like so articulate. And, I met her at the Esoteric Book Conference the year I gave a talk on surrealism there one year, I think 7 years ago or so. And then I saw her again at the Mortlake follow-up Williams set up at the Masonic Temple in Greenwood, which is nice. I mean, I really missed them. I wish he would put them back, but I can understand why he is reluctant to shoulder that responsibility. He's had a few years without doing it, but
nice. Well, Jon, thank you so much for your time, your insight, and the education you gave us and the audience. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks. I'm happy to talk with you. Thanks for inviting me. It's really enjoyable.
Okay, that was Jon Graham with an interesting conversation about surrealism and esotericism. I love surrealist art. I love surrealist poetry. I love surrealist film. I love surrealism. I think it's just an interesting approach to art. I love the overlap with dreams. And I also like the opportunity that surrealism gives us to step outside of the rational mind and the analytical intellect and go into the irrational, go into the absurd, go into things that are transcendent to conscious interpretation, as it were, the world of dreams, which I think David Lynch, for instance, he's great with that. So to talk about these things with Jon was such a pleasure. And to hear these interesting anecdotal stories was so interesting. What a cool person. What a interesting person. I would love to be a fly on the wall and, some of the conversations he's had and the places he's traveled to and the people he's known. I mean, I'm a little jelly.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, he's a fascinating guy, and it is such a fascinating topic. Surrealism. If you don't know much about it, you might just think it's just another art form, but it's so interesting because it's so much more. I mean, it could be a lifestyle for a lot of people who kind of engage in it. Like you said, and like we talked about, poetry, cinema, visual art. I mean, it's kind of limitless, and it really can go hand in hand with a lot of the stuff that we talk about on this show regarding, magic and mysticism, because it is so intertwined with the unconscious as really the foundation, but also the whole idea of it being surrealism being super reality or super rational, or not super rational, but super real. It's a really interesting concept and path, and yeah, I'm glad we did it.
And there's an interesting overlap even in like Zen ideas, and I think that surrealism offers a great space for magic, and a lot of great surrealists were magicians. Salvador Dali was definitely intentionally into magic, and hell, even H.R. Geiger, which you could say he's a symbolist on one hand, or you could say he's a surrealist on the other, but he very much intentional magician. And so there's that magical overlap there, which is so intriguing to me. The idea, because when you're entering into the magical world, or there's a lot of really cool Haitian art too, made by voodoo initiates, like Franz Zephyrin was one, Hector Hippolyta was another, and they use the surrealist modality to depict their experiences with the Loa and the spirits of nature. Or Leonora Carrington is another excellent example of an intentional magic user who was also depicting her astral experiences. Hilda af Klimt, who is an maestra of abstraction, but there's certainly surrealist elements in her work too. And the overlap between the symbolist movement and the surrealist movement is one that I always find just endlessly inspiring. I mean, I can read a volume of Apollinaire and Mallarmé and be very satisfied with the overlap and the sort of common ground, as well as the divergences. I think it's nice. It's like with the symbolist, you're entering into a symbolic awareness and a sort of intuitive cognizing, but with the surrealist, you're entering into a sort of dream state where you're no longer cognizing at all, really, you could say, but you're moving through things in a sort of almost abstract way.
But of course, there are always going to be symbols, as is, obviously evident in, dream work and stuff. Dreams are surreal, but they're also symbolic. So there is a real blurred line there, for sure.
Said. Well said. So book-wise, what do you have for us this week?
Okay, so this is actually one of the most interesting and engrossing books I've read in a long time. In the prologue, the author writes, I will be analyzing a collection of ancient texts that claim to reveal the true nature of reality and describe a way towards liberation from mental delusion. So, sounds very interesting to me. The title is Hermetic Spirituality and the Historical Imagination, Altered States of Knowledge in Late Antiquity by Wouter Hanegraaff. It's a really great book. Essentially, it's a commentary and an exploration of the ideas, concepts, techniques found in the Corpus Hermeticum. It's a very scholarly journey into the heart of the Hermetica, but not in a tedious or bland way. It's written in a style that's engaging and entertaining. And while it is scholarly, there is a lot of speculation that he makes in the book, which is totally fine. It's all very well informed and rational. In the book, he helps establish a very believable and viable context for the period, a context for the people who composed it and those who followed the doctrines outlined within it. He makes a compelling argument for instance, for Iamblichus, as well as Zosimos. as being likely initiates in Hermeticism, as found in Greco-Roman Egypt. He describes like a very likely congregational and priestly structure for the practice, which is at its core very Egyptian, but also undeniably informed and infused by the ethnic influences that were inescapable in this time and place. I was just really impressed with this work, especially how deeply Wouter goes with his analyzing and exploration. It's a book that I plan on reading, multiple times because, I find myself focusing on just a few pages at a time, and you could literally just read 2 pages and just kind of contemplate what you've read for a while. And it takes a little bit of time to digest because it's just so full of really interesting knowledge, and he put a lot of work into it, obviously. So that is my review. Highly recommend Hermetic Spirituality and the Historical Imagination, Altered States of Knowledge by Wouter J. Hanegraaff, and it was put out by Cambridge University Press. It is a little pricey. I want to say it's close to $150, which I typically don't buy books that expensive, but I would say that it's definitely worth every penny, rather than buy maybe 2 or 3 mediocre books, or some leather-bound limited run book about Saint Cyprian or something like that. I think this is money well spent.
Well, Professor Hanegraaff is one of the leading minds in this field of study and of this generation. And his opinions, his perceptions are based on a very, very meticulous scrutiny of the subject matter, of the milieu, of the context. There are very few people who understand the subject as well as he does.
Oh, and it's evident when you dig into it. I mean, it's so deep. It's perfect for nerds like us.
Well, thanks again for that review, Dominic. Much appreciated. Much appreciated. I also want to give a plug to a band called Crooked Mouth. They put out an album recently, which I've been enjoying a great deal. I believe they're a Lithuanian band. And the album is called Between the Magician and the Fool, which is an intriguing, captivating title that I can't stop thinking about the title of this album. It just, something about it really just hooks me. But the music is excellent. I love it. It's really good, really thoughtful, mystical, somewhat apocalyptic, folk with traditional elements to it. It even has a touch of I would say almost like a surrealist influence to it. Really beautiful music. And again, the band's name is Crooked Mouth, and the album is called Between the Magician and the Fool. We are not being paid anything to promote this. We are just promoting it because we like to promote people who are doing cool things, and they're doing something cool. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you on the next one. We'll see you on the flip side. You can find us everywhere you find things. So do the things and find the things and meet us there.
Okay, that's good.